It's a pleasure to be here in front of such a distinguished audience, frankly. I remember 32 years ago this November being in the building next door, the Jubilee Auditorium, where Chancellor Peter Severin handed me my PhD. And that set me off on a course of an academic career, or a career as a public intellectual, if you prefer, that has been very different, I suspect, than the careers of many of you in this room. I'm not a Ukrainian-Canadian studies specialist. I'm not a Ukrainianist. I'm somewhere in between, because all of my academic life I have taught in mainstream departments, in the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto, in the Department of Geography at Queen's, the Department of History at the University of British Columbia, and finally for the last 25, 30 years, in the Department of Politics and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada. So my career has been in the mainstream, but as I think most of you know, I have taken an active, vigorous, and sometimes controversial role in promoting the interests of Ukraine and Ukrainian-Canadian issues. I want to share with you the course of that career and speak a little bit to some of the themes that I've heard raised in the last day about the future of Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian studies and where we need to go and how we need to get there. Now, as many of you know, I was born in Kingston, Ontario, a small community in eastern Ontario, a very Anglo-Celtic Protestant society when I was born there. It's still pretty much the same. The very name Kingston, the King's Town, suggests to you the nature of the community. The university I went to, Queen's, very British. By and large, most of the people I grew up amongst, my neighbors, my school chums, the people I went to high school and university with, were people who were indifferent or ignorant or on occasion hostile to the very nature of someone identifying themselves as a Ukrainian. I don't want to belabor the point. I'm not going to play the victim card here, but there were incidents of discrimination and incidents throughout high school, for example, of people telling me that stories I had heard at home from my parents who'd come after the Second World War as so-called displaced persons were lies or anti-Soviet propaganda, that my godmother who told me about surviving the Holodomor was a liar, or perhaps confused. So when I grew up and entered Queen's University with some connection to the Ukrainian-Canadian community through SUM, sent away to Camp Veselka, far from a rainbow, frankly, for summers. I had a bit of a connection, but there was a very small Ukrainian community, so we lived cooperatively, quite quietly. When I got to Queen's, I went in as a biologist. I was going to be a herpetologist, studying reptiles and amphibians. That was my career, a biogeographer perhaps. But as it turned out, for reasons I won't go into today, I eventually moved into human geography, and under the tutelage of Peter Goheen, who has since become a lifelong friend, I was instructed, disciplined, and told that my ideas about what I would like to do for an MA thesis were wrong, and I should instead do a historical geography of Ukrainians in Kingston. I hated the thought. Perished the idea that I should study the community I came from. I thought that was a boring subject. But I had very little choice. So I began doing oral history, and that was under the influence of Dr. Richard Pierce, who would establish the Limestone Press and actually publish several works of mine and of my colleague Bogdan Kordan in due course. As I began exploring my community, and geography is about exploration, shouting out, saying, look what I've found, look at the patterns, look at how I got here, look at where I come from and how I get back to where I started, I began finding out things that I had not ever realized about my own hometown. I recognized, for example, that despite the apparent tranquility of our community, the first Ukrainian hall in Kingston was actually one established by the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association on James Street, which I had never been told about my entire life. I found out by interviewing interwar immigrants that there were people who had been in Kingston before them, and so I came across I remember on the 14th of February 1978, Valentine's Day, because my girlfriend was very upset that I left her and went to Toronto to interview Nick Sokoliuk, who turned out to have been one of the people interned in Fort Henry during this country's first national internment operations. So I learned about that. I learned from Mrs. Kharatinyuk, whose husband had fought in the Second World War in the Canadian Armed Forces, about the careers of Bogdan Panchuk and Stanley Froelich, the men and women who'd established the Servicemen's Association overseas, the London Club, and who went on to create the Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau that brought so many of those DPs, members of the Divizia, OPA, OUN, Holodomor survivors, and so on, to Canada in the Third Wave. I learned about the emergent nature of ethnicity, how it was shaped by and responded to and recreated by the socioeconomic and political environment that wave after wave of Ukrainians encountered when they came here. Yet as I was doing all of this, I always wanted to remain, as it were, in the mainstream. So when I took up an offer of a doctoral position, my first choice was the University of Chicago, where I was accepted. But instead of going to geography at the University of Chicago, as a result of a fateful encounter with Leszek Kuczynski from the University of Alberta, I chose U of A. And when I came here, I came again to go into a mainstream department of geography. I was interested more in how Canada, or more broadly the Anglo-American world, had dealt with the displaced persons of my parents' immigration, about the role played by Canadians of Ukrainian heritage who facilitated that third wave, about the consequences of their encounter, and so on. I was interested in those issues, newcomers versus old-timers. And when I brought that as a dissertation topic to the University of Alberta in 1979, I encountered pushback in the department. I was supposed to be studying the Arctic, was the concern. The head of the department was concerned with my topic. And in fact, as a result of the ensuing tensions between what the head of the department wanted me to do, the founder of the department, the late Bill Wonders, and my own supervisor, my comps, when they came, I was failed by one person, Dr. Wonders. So there was prejudice at that time. And I remember very clearly, this would have been about 1980, that I drifted over to the CIUS and met for the first time Manoli Lupul. Manoli Lupul offered me support and in time engaged me in the oral history project that the Institute was promoting at the time, giving me the opportunity to travel across Western Canada and interview many of the people who played a definitive role in the creation of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. Eventually, of course, as I mentioned, I completed my PhD 32 years ago, granted by Dr. Severin next door, and left for Toronto. I left for Toronto on a postdoc. I left to go to the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto, where I would spend approximately the next 3 years. I was already associated with the Chair of Ukrainian Studies through Professor Magochi, and I walked right into one of the biggest controversies our community faced in the last century. In April of 1984, some of you may recall, the government of Canada established the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, headed by Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes. When I arrived in Toronto in the spring of '84, I found myself volunteered, I'll put that in quotation marks, to join the Civil Liberties Commission, a group headed by the late John Gregorovich, who only passed away a week or so ago. A group established by our community in conjunction with other East European communities to address the bogus allegations that had been circulated at that time about the alleged presence of thousands of Nazi war criminals in our midst. This precipitated a choice. I had come from a good university, I had my PhD, I was in a department of geography, no one was questioning my interest in refugees. This would have been a perfect career to just stay in what I was doing. But I was faced with a choice. Do I become engaged in advocating for our community, or do I step aside? There was a bit of a discussion yesterday between Professor Marples and Professor Magochi about can you be a public intellectual and a scholar at the same time or not? I must say I smile to this day thinking about the discussion yesterday because both of them are both, but they like to pretend that they weren't. I remember as an undergraduate reading something from someone who said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is, however, to change it. I think Carl somebody. So I remember that and thinking to myself, I've been trained to think and to act. And so I took on the role of a public intellectual, even as I continued in the role of being a fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies and at the University of Toronto, and eventually coming back to Queen's on another postdoc until 1990. I transferred to the Royal Military College, where I remain to this day. Now, I want to talk about two of those issues that came out of '84. One was, I've already suggested to you, the war crimes issue, where I think I earned my spurs in the public domain. I remember, with the help of Miroslav Yurkevich, drafting an editorial that was published in the Globe and Mail in March of '85 called Ukraine's Wartime Unit Never Linked to War Crimes. This was about the Ukrainian Divizia Halachina. I remember the encounters, and this was a very contentious, frankly, and troubling and difficult period of time for several years, being caught up in the very public debate about Nazis in Canada. The miasma still continues. But now, from the point of view of several decades later, it's very clear that much of that controversy was stoked by the Soviets. We now know without a shadow of a doubt that there were NKVD veterans who were actually informers for the Deschênes Commission. That only comes out many more years later. But as that all ended, and as we had created the Civil Liberties Commission, the Deschênes Commission comes to an end, and in 1987 gives its final report. The position that the Ukrainian-Canadian community had taken, namely that all war criminals found in Canada should be brought to justice under Canadian criminal law, was adopted as the Made in Canada solution by the Government of Canada. That did not dissipate the issue. It still, as I say, continues, lingers to this day, but we dealt with it. And we dealt with it as an effective, organized community, largely centered in Toronto, but also with support from across the country. Just at that same period, the Civil Liberties Commission under Grigorovich, for, again, reasons we need not go into today, was pushed away from the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress and became the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We took it upon ourselves in 1987 and 1988, and for several decades after that, to raise the issue of Canada's first national internment operations. You may remember that around that time, 87, 88, the Japanese-Canadian community, the Miki brothers and so on, had concluded a very successful campaign to get the government of Canada to acknowledge what had happened during the internment operations in the Second World War. So we raised that issue, and with my colleague Bogdan Kordan, we wrote a piece also published in the Globe and Mail that called upon the government not to apologize, but rather to recognize what had happened, to provide historical markers, symbolic redress, a trust fund. And that indeed is what happened some 25 years later in 2008 when the Government of Canada signed a settlement agreement, an accord that offered $10 million in symbolic restitution to the community through the Shevchenko Foundation in perpetuity in an inclusive endowment council to commemorate the First World War internment operations. I think a rather historic and major achievement. Now, I have to say, in fairness, that the CIOS, which had given me support when I was here, was not particularly engaged in the war crimes issue, was not particularly helpful or engaged with the redress campaign, despite the fact that they'd done some very good research, Francis Ripp and John Hurt Thompson, for example, Loyalties and Conflict, their book on World War I. Why? Well, some of it was because, of course, people don't like to soil themselves as scholars in the public arena. Some of it was a preoccupation with pioneer settlement as an experience. Some of it was a certain left-wing bias against the DPs and who they represented. But the point is, the CIOS didn't really act as well as it could have. Although, again, acknowledging Peter Savarin here, I do recall his efforts on the Deschênes Commission. So, thinking back about all of this period, and I'm cutting short because my time is coming to an end, as I came to Alberta, the CIOS had just started. As I was leaving, we had other centers being established. The Chair of Ukrainian Studies in Toronto in 1980, the Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center at the University of Manitoba in '81, the University of Ottawa's position in 1993, the Prairie Centre in 1998, so a period of almost 22 years of centre building, of institute building. 20 more years have gone by roughly since then, and I have to ask, what has been achieved? Well, on one level, a great deal. We've talked about the books, the publications, the conferences. That's all true. But I wonder whether those who funded much of this, i.e. the Hromada, are really happy with what they got. Now again, this raises another issue. Are we here to please the Hromada? Are we here for the community? And there was an interesting discussion that Manoli Lupo provoked yesterday on that. Or are we, as academics, possessed of academic freedom and such, we should study whatever we want? Thinking about this, and again, I'm going to skip forward, drawing on what I heard yesterday, I'd like to propose a few remedies, and in fact, this has already been suggested in some degree by the previous speaker. I think what we certainly need is much greater interdisciplinary, collaborative efforts, both nationally and internationally. It's very clear to me, as someone who's been on the margins of Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian studies, as someone in the mainstream of academic life, teaching courses on the former Soviet Union or the Soviet Union, where I always include, a lecture or two on Ukraine and Ukrainian issues, teaching courses on political geography, where I also plug that in. I mean, I've been able to teach about Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian themes, but in all these years, in some 40 years of watching these institutes spring up and these centers and all the rest of it, I've noticed that there's never been, in all that period, one single annual or biannual conference that brings all these people together. There has been very little direct sharing of knowledge or results. There's been a kind of competition, which you saw, somewhat subtly played out yesterday. I think some of you are noticing. There has been very little of that kind of coordination or cooperation, and in fact, sometimes barely concealed hostility. And I think that has disappointed our Hromada. There's a little bit of donor burnout. There's a little bit of indifference. Of the 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian heritage, I suspect the vast, vast majority of them have never heard of the CIUS or the Chair of Ukrainian Studies, the Prairie Centre, the Ukrainian Studies Centre in Manitoba, and so on. They donate, this is true. The endowments are large, this is true. But the question is, so what? How do we move forward? I think we obviously all agree that the desire should be to continue the study of Ukraine. We all came to this because of the Ukrainian cause, however you want to define it. But where are we with regards to the next generation? How are we funding them? Yes, we have these posters, and I had a chance to look at them, and I'd encourage all of you to do that as well. There's some very interesting work being done by the next generation. But we've come together and we've spent time now looking back, by and large, looking forward. How do we reinvigorate the donor base? How do we reach out to the people where they live in Canada, wherever they may live in Canada? How do we combine the interest in homeland issues, that abiding interest in Ukraine, with where we are today? So thinking about that, and hopefully I've given you some things to consider, I want to end with the words of a man who was very formative in my life, a person who many years ago, as a teacher, volunteered to serve with the Canadian Forces overseas in the Second World War, Bogdan Panchuk. When he was asked to explain himself, why he did what he did as a teacher, as a RCAF officer, as a warrior, and as a community activist, he said simply this: I have a gospel. What is my gospel? Do something. And that's what I hope we will do coming out of this conference. Thank you very much.